Welcome to Bounce Back Stronger, the podcast that explores ways to find peace and purpose no matter what happens. I'm your host, Donna Ferris, and today we have children's book author, attorney, and inclusion activist Peggy Moss with us. A little bit about Peggy. Peggy is the vice chair of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the award-winning author of three children's books, Say Something, Our Friendship Rules, and One of Us. These books focus on bullying, relationships, and identity, and her writing has been featured in publications like Learning Justice Magazine, The New York Times, and Empowering Parents. Peggy also served as Maine's Assistant Attorney General, the Associate Director of the Center for the Prevention of Hate Violence, and has spoken to diverse audiences across North America about building safe, inclusive spaces. And I am so honored to have her in our space on Bounce Back Stronger. Welcome, Peggy. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Yeah, we've been talking a little bit beforehand, and we decided we better start recording.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just start off with the children's books because I always love children's books. Your children's books tackle sensitive topics like bullying and identity. What made you write these stories and tell us a little bit about how they've impacted young readers?
So I didn't really mean to write children's books. And in fact, if I'm coming clean, I thought it wasn't really being a writer to write a children's book. So what happened was I was working at the Center for the Prevention of Hate Violence with Steve Wessler, who had been my boss at the Maine Department of Attorney General. And he went to start the center because we were seeing cases of younger and younger people committing acts of hate violence and tracing those cases back to schools and learning that every time that we were dealing with property damage or a violent threat or an assault, when we traced back, we found that there had been weeks or sometimes months of teasing and terrible climate in the school that had gone unnoticed, undealt with, and then eventually had led to something really terrible that bubbled up to the Attorney General's office. So we had started to do outreach to teachers, to police departments, to healthcare providers. And I was dispatched to go talk to a bunch of young nursing students who were about to get placed in schools. And I did a 3-hour presentation, which I thought was really quite engaging.
Of course.
About how, yeah, right. I mean, I tried. But how to identify that perhaps the kid showing up in your nurse's office might be experiencing teasing or bullying. And like us, kids never present with, we don't come home from work and say, "Hi, darling, I've had a stressful day." We come home and we're like, "What these shoes here? Why do you smell bad?" And kids are the same, right? They don't say, "I'm having an uncomfortable experience at school." They say, "I feel sick to my stomach. I have a headache. I don't want to go to school." And so how do you break through? And nurses are the perfect people to pick up on this. So we had a long session, 3 hours, and this woman came up to me at the end of it and she said, I'm going to call her Sarah, that was not her name. And she said, that was terrible. And I thought, oh, geez. She said, that was a really hard session. And for a minute I took it on the chin, like, oh, I did a bad job presenting. And I said, I'm really sorry. And she said, you need to understand, when I was in high school, I was teased all the time. And people call me names. People put sticky notes on my back, like to trip me and push me. And she said she complained to her parents, and her parents were like, buck up. It's okay. Get over it. And she couldn't. It got worse. She started to cut herself. This was the 80s. Cutting wasn't something that people talked about or knew about at that time. And eventually her parents decided with her that they had to pull her out of that school and put her in a different school. And she said, when she came up to my desk after that session, she said, someone walked up to me yesterday, and now Sarah's 30 years old. She comes up to my desk, she said, somebody came up to me yesterday and said, "Sarah, it's so good to see you." And Sarah's like, "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." And the woman said, "Oh, I went to high school with you, and I just wanted to tell you, I always felt so sorry for you." And Sarah said, I could tell she wanted me to say, "Oh, it's okay. And she was like, all I could think of was, you never spoke up for me. You never said anything. You never sat next to me. And she said, I couldn't make her feel better. I just turned around and walked away. And
Good
I
for her.
left that. Yeah, exactly.
Good for her.
And I walked away from that experience and I went back to my office and in about 10 minutes wrote down what became the book, Say Something. And that's not a good story of getting published for anyone who ever has wanted to publish anything, because then I called the first publisher and read the story over the phone and they were like, oh, that's great, we'll buy it. And that's just not what happens. And then it sold
No,
100,000 copies, which is totally not what happened. But it did have a
but
typo and
that's
that does
okay.
happen.
But that's okay. It's a good, if it has to happen to anybody for any book, that's the one. Thank you.
So that's how that book came to be. And the whole idea of it, it has like a grand total of something like 40 words in it, because I wrote it hoping it's not didactic. The idea is that kids fill in all the blanks, right? What happens? Why does it happen? And that it starts conversations. And that was my goal. And in fact, kids have done that. Like they've made Say Something plays, they have Say Something days, somebody did a Say Something music video. Some kids wrote a Do Something book to like say something's not enough. And that was a really great outcome. It came out in 2004. It was called a bystander book. And it came out in that moment when it was, are you a bully or a bystander or a target? And one of the things I was really trying to convey at the time to teachers and to counselors and to kids is we're all of those things on different days and different times in our lives. And please don't decide that Joey is a bully in second grade and then tell the third grade teacher, here comes Joey the bully. Let's not do that.
Yeah, but that's really brilliant too, because you're right. I think we can all be in those situations up until, and including adulthood. Yeah, what an amazing story. And how about the other two books? It sounds like they were similar vein.
So our friendship rules came out of another sort of tantrum on my part. I was talking to my very sweet and brilliant niece, who was at the time in grade 6, and she was grappling in her brilliant way with this problem, was that she had really good friends and she was being told girls are mean.
Hmm.
Oh, girls are mean and they're spiteful. And so when she would have an argument with a friend, the message she'd get was, that's just how girls are. And she was like, but that doesn't make sense. And so our friendship rules is a story about two girls who have a disagreement and figure it out. Because it didn't make sense to my kids. It didn't make sense to my niece. It didn't make sense to me that everything that we know about, I will go out on a big flyer and say, Donna, you probably have women friends who are really important to you.
Mhm.
I have women friends who are my lifeline, and we think nothing of that. And then at the same time, turn around and say, girls are mean. And when our kids come home from school and say, Natalie made me feel bad, we're like, oh, honey, that's just how girls are. Like, really?
We shouldn't be accepting that, right? Yeah.
True. It's like, so that was our French rules. And then one of us was actually where our conversation started. We were talking about how we're more than one thing. And one of us is that book. I have never been able to be a full-fledged member of any tribe. I'm always a little off. I'm sort of half of this gang and half of that gang and half of this and half of that. And most of my beloved people in my life have similar experiences. And so one of us is the experience of joining with someone without having to join everything.
Nice.
One side story, there was only one, I think, maybe two kids in my high school, which reflects so poorly on that time, but we're making progress, who were out and gay. And one of them was a young Black man who was out and gay and beloved and just wonderful. And I named one of the characters after him. And that character wanted to be a part of a group that had flowered lunchboxes. And he wanted a flowered lunchbox. And people said, no, you can't, because that's for this group. And you're not that group. You're not a girl. And so Rodney gets a flowered lunchbox at the end of One of Us. And so
Should we all have one?
we should all have whatever it is we want. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Do you have plans to write anything else in that series or?
I think I'm done with
Yeah.
children's books. I have written a book about that no one's wanted, about how scary old people are, getting over
Mm,
that hurdle, being
yeah,
afraid
that's a big
of
one.
old people. When my older brother, who was very dear to me, was sick, he went from being very handsome marathon runner, dashing lawyer, to a man with a massive scar up the back of his head and wispy hair and sort of a misshapen head in a wheelchair. And he was still my bright-eyed brother, and he still felt like my bright-eyed big brother. But I was pushing him in a wheelchair and we were shopping, and this little girl took a look at him and they started doing like the little peekaboo game, and she was giggling, and her mother was looking at something on a shelf and hadn't noticed. And she turned around and she saw her daughter interacting with this scary looking person. And her daughter was sort of moving toward my brother, and the mother grabbed her daughter by the arm and yanked her back
Mm,
in fear. And I thought, she can tell her daughter a million times that people in wheelchairs aren't scary, or that people with disabilities aren't lesser or people to be afraid of. And that child has learned indelibly everything she needs to know about
yeah.
people who don't look like her. So I would still like to write a book that crosses that divide.
Yeah. I hope you get a chance to.
We'll see.
Yeah. That's an important one for sure. Funny, last weekend I spent doing a yoga training. It was called adaptive yoga, accessible yoga, chair yoga. And yeah, we need more of that, that support, that inclusivity for those folks. Because there are folks.
Oh, they are our fault. They are us. And as a friend of mine who's a disability rights activist says, it's the one thing we can all be on any given day tomorrow. We can join that category.
Absolutely.
And that should be a winning argument for all of
Yeah.
us to remember that it's all of us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, I love the work you're doing. And I think you've written about your personal losses as well, about your brother in a little bit more depth. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and your writing about loss?
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I was thinking about how to talk to you about that because
Hard, isn't it?
because I figured it would come up, and I was reminded of when I sort of figured out the role that those big losses played and how our lives panned out, and how my life has sort of panned out. And it's worth mentioning that I have relatively significant anxiety. And as a writer with anxiety, that has meant telling catastrophic stories on a fairly regular basis, some of which come true and some of which do not. And so when my family decided to move to Sri Lanka for a year in the middle of a massive civil war, which made sense from my partner's perspective because he does not have anxiety and doesn't worry about these things, and was ready for an adventure and had a sabbatical year. It all sort of click, click, click. I went along with it. And I remember packing up with one of my neighbors, and she said two things. She was sitting there and she was wrapping up plates because we were going to rent out our house. And she said, "How can you do this to your children?"
Oh, wow.
And
Oh,
our kids were age 5 and 7.5 at the time. And I told the story that probably by now you would expect me to tell, which is, we live in a very white town. I do not want to raise ugly Americans. I want them to know that the world is not just what they see. I want them to have the experience, blah, blah, blah. And as I'm telling this, I'm basically hyperventilating, like, I don't know. I don't know. And then she says, "But you have an anxiety disorder." And I was like, yeah, good point there. And yet we were all up and go. And it really wasn't until we'd been there for about 3 weeks and a Sri Lankan friend of mine took me to an English language meditation. And we were in that meditation, and it was led by this very funky monk with a deep German accent. There was a lot about it that was kind of funny. And I spent a lot of that meditation wondering whether the mosquito that was flitting around me was going to bite me and give me dengue fever, because this is what we
of
do.
course.
And And somebody asked about the Vasana jnanas. I'll be saying it completely wrong, but the knowledges that arise from insight meditation. This was in the question and answer part at the end, and his answer was very pragmatic. He was like, yes, the separation of mind and body, the rule of cause and effect, and the elimination of obstacles. And he said, like the obstacle of the delusion that something is permanent.
Yeah, impermanence.
Right. And I realized that's how I got here. I got here because my big brother got sick and died. And my beloved nephew, who my sister and her husband raised perfectly flawlessly until he was 2.5, died of a brain tumor. And our 18-month-old daughter narrowly escaped meningitis in developed countries with lots of money and brilliant medical systems. And my job was to learn something from those losses. If I think about the impact of those losses, have many impacts, but part of it sort of illogically, I think, was that.
What am I worried about anymore?
I mean, at one point I remember railing like, I have perspective. Okay, I've got perspective. No more. I don't need any more perspective. I
Yep.
don't need my dad to have another stroke. I've got it. I got the message. We were really lucky for a long time. I get it.
But but that's the nature of humanity. We forget.
Me too.
We forget. And I have anxiety too. A lot of the reason I do this is because I went through these repeated, really difficult times. And it took quite a few of them for me to say, wait a minute, I need to stop taking things for granted. And it doesn't mean that I don't fall into that feeling again all the time, but I'm able to snap out of it faster.
Yeah.
And like we were talking in the beginning before we recorded, those morning moments where I spend time looking at the meditations and trying to remember who I really want to be because it's so important because we don't have that much time. But doesn't mean that I don't by the end of the day, I'm not fit to talk to anybody by the end of the day because
Exactly.
because there's so many things that pile on and when you have anxiety you're constantly trying to control things, even though you really don't have control. And I think that's one of the things we learn. This impermanence thing is really helpful for anxiety, actually,
It's really helpful for anxiety.
because it takes the wheels off. It's like, okay, I don't have control over any of it.
Right.
What am I doing?
Right. Right. There were so many funny moments, but I think my favorite when we were planning to go to Sri Lanka was a conversation with the consulate because I called and I said, I don't see anything on your website about sort of a how-to kit for how to move to Sri Lanka. And I was like, because they
Where's
had them
where's
for
your how
other,
to?
they
I need
they
some
had them
Q&A
for
here.
they
I love
had
it.
them for other countries. And she was like, oh, your company will give that to you. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, what company? And she was like, the company that's sending you there. And I was like, oh, we don't have a company that's sending us there. And she's like, why are you going? And I
My
was like,
God.
because because we want to. And she's like, oh, people don't do that. And I'm like, what do you mean people don't do that? She's like, that's not a thing. People don't do that. It was like, that was the end of the conversation. Like you were
Oh my,
doing something that simply does not happen.
oh my God, you have a book in this.
It was a very powerful thing for a lot of lessons learned from that trip.
How long were you
Our
there?
family. We were there for a year or just
Wow.
about a year until it became unsafe for us to be there. And the balance of the wonderful things we were learning and the wonderful people we were with and the tiny bit of maybe good work we were doing was not nearly enough to balance the risk we were putting our children in.
Yeah. Wow. And how long ago was that?
2005, 2006.
Wow. Wow.
which in retrospect turned out to be, I think, is sort of the peak of the Civil War. It did not make a lot of sense at the time. But also, it was a big reminder of the way that it's so humbling to travel and to be reminded of how the West loves to characterize what's happening in other places. Our reality there was not at all reflected in the press that my family was reading here.
Yeah, for sure. And what's interesting too about anxiety, though, is you were kind of in a constant state of alert, which is actually pretty comforting for an anxious person, at least for me. I find I'm really
Yeah.
good in a crisis. I'm good in extended crisis. Like in the pandemic, I was like, this is this is great.
I've
I
been
know what I'm
preparing
doing
for
here.
this my whole
Whole
life.
life. Exactly. And it was a horrible thing. Don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. But for anybody
No,
who's listening who's
no.
got anxiety, I bet you they all felt the same way. It's like, hey, welcome to my
Yeah,
everyday. I'm always worried about
yeah,
everything.
yeah.
Oh, that's not funny. But it is true though. I think there's something about that that's really interesting.
Well, there are a lot of people who say, and I don't really have an argument for them. There are a lot of people who say that having anxiety is a bit of a privilege, drumming
Whoa.
up trauma,
Whoa.
as opposed to having
Ah,
to face the reality of, you know, are you safe? Do you have food? Can you get to your children without, I
yeah,
mean, that,
I see that.
and there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, I really do see that. And to
Yeah.
constantly have that trigger going on because and it's not there. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's really a fair comment, actually. I'd love to talk a little bit about you quitting your job. I would love to hear about that if it's possible.
I'm happy to talk about it. So it's been almost 3 years now, and it was really hard to quit. And part of it was that the financial anxiety. I had a job that was paying off big debts that needed to get paid off. And I was working in a big corporate environment, and I was ghost writing for a long time. I was ghost writing for the leaders of this organization. And I kind of thought they didn't know. I didn't really know how it worked yet. So it wasn't until one managing partner retired, and then the new managing partner came in and sent me an email and said, "Hey, as the new managing partner, I'm hoping you'll write my introduction and this and that." And I was like, "Oh, that was not my job. I had a different job title." And that new managing partner was in place for about 3 months before when COVID hit. And I got a call saying, "We need you to be the head of crisis communications."
Oh dear.
And I said, "I run the proposal team." And they're like, "Yeah, but we know what you really do." And I said, "I don't even do communications. I don't know what I don't know about communications." And they're like, "Yeah, the first call is tomorrow morning at 7:30. Anyway, fast forward to 2.5 years.
Love
Meetings
that.
from 7:30 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. Initially, they were on conference calls, and then they moved to Zoom. And it was fascinating, right? It was a front seat to in a very elite little table of dealing with an issue, super smart people dealing with an issue that was unprecedented. We ran out of ways to say unprecedented, uncharted,
My God.
unchartered for a little while, which was hilarious. And so I was in the room, and I was on a 10-minute response time on my phone. And I had been trying to quit for 7 years by then. So at one point, I'd gotten so close to quitting that I had actually accepted a job and given notice. And in response to my notice, and the job I had accepted, by the way, was a contract job, 1/3 the pay and no benefits. And so when I handed in my notice, they said, "Is there anything we can do?" And I said, "No, because what you do is offer people money, and clearly I'm not leaving for money." And they offered me the same benefits and the same salary to work a little more than half as much of the time. which sounds really fabulous. And I felt cuffed to it. How could I not? That would be foolish. It would give me time to write. But then COVID hit. And so I went from that sort of not quite 3/4 time to all the time.
Wow.
And I had been trying to quit because this had nothing to do with who I was. I've spent all this time saying, I work in this job, but that's not who I am. And I felt a little bit like a zoo animal in my office. Like I was sort of the funny one who couldn't dress well, but that was okay because she did good work. And
One of us.
not one of us.
Yeah. Wow.
And and it was hard to quit because they said nice things, and all of that sort of anxiety and self-deprecating, not real self-deprecation, not like playing self-deprecating, but
Mm.
I really liked the praise. And they learned very quickly that's all they had to do was tap me on the head, and I would work until my fingers bled. And at the same time, my kids hated my job. They hated what it took me away from, what I was unable to do. And you miss a kid's play. And if you miss a kid's play and you're sitting at your desk, you don't know what you've missed until you go to one. And then you realize what you've missed because the people sitting next to you are comparing it to something you didn't know happened and couldn't have imagined would be this terrific because you didn't see it. And so I had 1,000 hurts like that most of us do. And I had hard conversations with my kids. I had some rules, which is if my child ever called, I answered no matter who was in my room or my office and no matter what was going on. But that sounds like the pledge of a 1950s husband. So I stayed with this job. I went to a coach. I said, I really want to leave this job, but I'm afraid I won't be able to find one that can support my family. And she said, sometimes staying isn't the safest option.
Wow.
I knew she was right. And I didn't take the advice because I didn't have the courage at the time. It wasn't until years later that I left, but it was that job I was trying to quit.
And you remembered that line though. I think it's really important. You don't know how long it'll take. Sometimes people will say that why would I say anything? They don't listen anyway, but they do.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's sort of notched into the back of my skull. And part of that fabulous deal they gave me was they gave me a coach they paid for to protect me from them laying too much work on me. So I went to that coach near the end of my rope, and I got to the end of my rope because a situation came up for one of the people who worked for me, who was tremendous and working incredibly hard. And she was slapped down by a partner behind her back, and it got elevated, and I couldn't protect my person. And that's when I snapped. And it was a clean break. It was like, done, just done,
Yeah.
irrevocably done. I quit, and I quit without a job. After all that fear, after all those years of being afraid to quit, I quit without a job. And I helped my mom move into a retirement community and was available to my kids. And it took me like a year to get used to not getting emails, except for like Nordstrom. And then really the second part of it that you ask, and I think it's an important one, it took me a really long time to be okay with not having that job. And then I, did some freelance, and now finally I'm working for an organization that I'm very proud to be working for. But it took a long time, and I was terrified that at 58 I would never get hired again. I was too old. And the other thing that I did, and I have to say this in case someone's out there that this is helpful for. When I quit my job, this scary thing happened, and that is that my world shrank on the spot. But I signed up for an improv class.
Wow.
And I went by myself to this little room above a bar. And I was in this room with people. I live in Toronto. And so Toronto is the world, right?
Hmm.
So people of all ages from all backgrounds speaking English as a second, third, fourth language. And the great thing about improv, among the great things about improv, is nobody cares what you do. It's just not part of the conversation. I mean, at the very end of an 8-week class, I found out that the really goofy guy beside me was a surgeon. I had no idea.
That's amazing.
I remember how it came. It was like two truths and a lie, and that in the game, and that's what came up. Like he was like, "And I'm a surgeon." I'm like, "Right." But I realized that my whole life I had been, as the youngest of five, in this deeply competitive environment growing up. I'd grown up with the winning of a conversation. And in improv, you don't win a conversation. It's like keeping a balloon in the air. Your
Yep.
whole idea is to listen and keep somebody else's idea afloat. And so the first few classes, I was an epic failure because I would do the like bump at the end, and everyone would look at me like, you popped the balloon. You ruined the you ruined the
You
game.
tied it up.
You
You
tied it
tied it
up.
up.
Yeah.
And that's not the
Well
point.
done,
Oh,
Nellie.
wow. Exactly. 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 Yeah.
So that was a really important thing. And it was tied to work because it just took me out of it.
Yeah.
It just took work completely out and reminded me of what it felt like to learn something new and start over doing things with two left feet and feeling wrong and getting started again. And I think it was a
That's
really
really,
important part of the process.
and I hate to say this, but we probably have to try to tie up, and I don't want to. But is there anything that you wanted to say or you wanted to share or I didn't ask that we should give time to here?
So the one thing that I thought I would talk about and didn't about loss. And
Yeah,
because I grew up in that super competitive family, and every single one of my siblings was the captain of the swim team. I don't know. I feel like that's the easiest way to sum it up.
that's
I
really
was a
good.
terrible swimmer, but not a terrible swimmer, but I was a really slow swimmer. I could watch people, this tells you about how old I am. I could watch people smoking cigarettes like while I was swimming. That's how slow I was going by them. But anyway, but there was that expectation of like
That you're going to be
excellence and
captain.
leadership and all that stuff. And so being a writer was not, that wasn't one of the job options. And so from a pretty young age, I had this idea that when I turned 50, I would quit my job and become a writer. That was the deal I made with myself.
Hmm.
And then my brother was diagnosed terminal at 37. And I realized you might not get 50. And so that's when I went back and got my MFA, started writing. And I think my life really changed a lot in that moment. And I think reminding ourselves that we might, in the best way, right? I mean, I know we say live like it's your last day on the planet, which I don't think we do that. And I'm not sure I'd want to be on that planet, but I do think that some of the things that we put off aren't aren't worth putting off.
And that is a great way to end a podcast. So, for all of you that are listening, if you've got a to-do list that you're waiting on, what would you say? Don't wait, right?
Don't be afraid.
From two people with anxiety. Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid.
Aw.
Don't be afraid. Yeah.
Well, this has been an incredible joy. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you for making it so easy. I really appreciate it. You created such a lovely space. I really appreciate it.
Ah, my absolute pleasure. That's all for today. If you want to learn more about Peggy's books and writing, those links will be in the episode notes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this episode was helpful. If it was, please subscribe, drop a review, or share it with your friends and family. That's the best way to get it in the hands of those who may benefit. And if my daughters Sienna and Sylvia are listening, I just want you to know how proud I am of you, and I love you so much. Bye now.